Ready to rock your canola season? Set the stage for your InVigor hybrid canola's performance with herbicide hits like Centurion ADV, Certitude, and the new Liberty Amp, plus fungicides like Cotegra, all from BASF. See the lineup at agsolutions.ca/canola fest.
Hello, my name is Tyler McCann, and I'm the Managing Director of the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. The Ag Policy Exchange webinar series offers a platform to dive into and explore diverse perspectives on critical policy issues facing Canadian agriculture and food. The webinars and all of CAPI's work is made possible thanks to the support of partners who know that agriculture and agri-food can do more and that policy plays a critical role in unlocking the sector's potential. Today's webinar was funded by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada under the Sustainable Canadian Agriculture Partnerships Agri-Competitiveness Program. We are also pleased that this webinar is part of our ongoing partnership with RealAgriculture. Working together, we're excited to bring deeper dialogue and tougher conversations to people working in and around the sector across multiple platforms. For more information and upcoming content, you can visit realagriculture.com or CAPI's website and subscribe to our mailing list. But before we begin our discussion with our panel today, we want to hear from you. We'll put a poll up on the screen and give you the choice to select your thoughts. Our poll question today is, what geopolitical dynamic will have the greatest impact on Canadian agriculture and food? A strong outcome in CUSMA negotiations, re-engaging and rebuilding the relationship with China, increased trade and engagement with other middle powers, or a renewed focus on domestic market because of the geopolitical challenges that exist. Look forward to hearing your perspectives, and I expect we'll get some different perspectives on these answers today. We've certainly touched on some of these issues on our 2026 Outlook webinar that we hosted last week. Please go to our YouTube channel to find out more and to understand the impacts that some of these outcomes, with a particular focus on the potential CUSMA renegotiation, may have on the sector and what it means going forward. So 55% of respondents said this morning that a strong outcome in CUSMA negotiations will have the greatest impact on the sector, with a bit of a split between the other three options. We look forward to getting perspectives from our panelists on that. To kick off our panel discussion today, I'm going to hand it over to my co-host for today's discussion, Kelvin Heppner. Kelvin is a key member of the RealAgriculture team, and he will start off our panel discussion. So Kelvin, why don't we bring you and the others on screen, and I will hand it over to you to introduce them and get into the discussion.
Thank you, Tyler. Yes, our three panelists for today's webinar are Wolfgang Alschner, Carlo, Dade, and Christopher White. And as I introduce them, we're going to ask each of them the same question to kind of set the stage. We, a couple of weeks ago now, saw Prime Minister Carney in Davos famously say that Canada and other middle powers should abandon nostalgia for the past rule-based order and instead, quote, take on the world as it is and not wait around for a world we wish to be. So our first panelist, introducing Chris White. Chris is the president and CEO of the Canadian Meat Advocacy Office based in Beijing, a relatively new role, as well as still serving that role as well with Canada Pork. Chris leads national efforts to expand export opportunities, rebuild technical and political engagement with China, and position Canada's red meat sector for long-term growth. So, Chris, why don't we start with you? When we hear Prime Minister Carney say that, what does that mean to you, the world as it is today, and where does Canada fit in it?
Well, I think it's self-evident that the world is an environment where the competition is it's relentless, right? And I think that's a shift from how the previous government approached a lot of our market access and our trade issues. I think that from an industry perspective, not just the commodity that I represent, but just more broadly speaking, there's a whole shift in tone and approach that is taking place within the framework of government. And that's, some departments are quite agile and other departments take a longer time to acclimatize to that. But the problem with those departments that are taking a bit of a longer time, we don't have that luxury. when we look at the challenges of the economy and how competitive it is. So, I think it's a welcome frame that the Prime Minister put forward last week. I think the other challenge that we have that builds off of that, though, is, you know, if I look at China as an example, when Carney came last month, which was terrific, there were 5 other world leaders that came through China last month as well. So regardless of what market that you're in and what leader you're meeting with or CEO you're meeting with, their attention is scarce. So when Canada is in and when Carney is in, the value proposition of why you want to invest in Canada, or why you want to invest or trade with Canada, it has to be articulated in a really clear, very high level, and a very forward-looking process. And sometimes I think we've all seen that that's been lacking. And then lastly, I would say that for industry in particular, we need to be present, right? Because if we're not there, when we opened this office in Beijing or in China last year, most of the competitors that sell red meat into China, they have some type of a presence on the ground. And then when the geopolitical issues are challenged and, our embassy officials or our consulate officials can't get meetings, then if industry is not there and government's not having access, then those issues just kind of sit dormant. So industry has to do a much more, in my view, take far more responsibility for their issues, and be far more present and proactive. So those would be my opening comments. Thank you.
Yeah. Lots to unpack there. Thank you, Chris. And we'll get to that over the discussion here. Our next panelist, though, Carlo Dade. Carlo is a familiar voice on Real Ag Radio and on Real Agriculture. He's the Director of International Policy at the University of Calgary's School of Public Policy. Carlo has an extensive background in international public policy, having most recently served as the founder and director of Trade and Trade Infrastructure Policy Research Centre at the Canada West Foundation. Carlo, when you heard Prime Minister Carney's line, I think it's probably has some roots in stoicism, take on the world as it is, not wait around for a world we wish to be. What's your perspective on that, or your view on the world as it is today?
Sure. Well, first, thanks, Kelvin, Tyler. It's always great to be with you guys. I love doing the seminars, and it's great to see colleagues and friends like Wolfgang and Chris. On Carney's comments, 2 points. What I heard was Shinzo Abe. You may remember that during the first Trump administration, the world was, we could say, maybe first introduced, with some nuance to first introduced, but first introduced to this idea of deliberate weaponized uncertainty in trade used by the hegemon, the power we expect to keep order or to provide certainty, reversing that role and using uncertainty as a leverage, weapon leverage in trade negotiations and coercive measures to advance U.S. interest. The response by Prime Minister Abe was to try and forge middle powers around the Pacific together to form an alternative, not just to Donald Trump, but the idea with the TPP, later renamed the CPTPP, was when the Americans took over from the Kiwis and the Chileans and Singapore, the idea was to turn this into a hedge against China. But it very quickly became apparent to Abe and other leaders, with the exception of Justin Trudeau, who almost sabotaged this, it became a vehicle to do exactly what Carney's talking about. So I see echoes from the first Trump administration. But stepping back, the issue we face is not the normal uncertainty that we have with business, the usual risk from environmental disruptions, COVID, or malevolent actors that tend to be short-term and specific. We're seeing systematic uncertainty in global markets, uncertainty as U.S. policy. So dealing with this uncertainty takes on different aspects, and dealing with like a one-off like COVID, or Argentina deciding to block exports of wheat because of problems back home. So dealing with this era of prolonged, deliberate uncertainty is the challenge. Bottom line, and we've seen this before, but with President Nixon, 1971, the Nixon shocks, the rewriting of the global trade order, that took 4 months. You had a competent administration, one we didn't necessarily like, but at least was competent and efficient in what they were doing. We're missing that nowadays. So we're looking at a period of prolonged uncertainty. Bottom line for business, especially with the US, the cost of trade is increasing. We've gone through an era of relatively low cost. The Americans handed us and everyone else an unbelievably great deal, easy, cheap access to the US market. That's come off the table. The Americans are renegotiating. It's going to be more expensive to access the US market because of friction, because of direct costs like tariffs, and because of what Chris mentioned, the need to actually invest money in presence, in assuring access, and gathering intelligence. Things we could skimp on before or avoid, like tariffs, have the appearance, and I would say mid 70% certainty that we're going to see these things going forward. So the cost of business is going to go up. What had been free and easy in the past is now going to carry a cost and be more difficult.
Yeah, that certainly is a theme that I think, that we're still trying to figure out, and everybody's trying to navigate. Rounding out our panel, finally, I'd like to introduce Wolfgang Alschner. Dr. Alschner is a faculty member at the Center for Law Technology Society and an associate professor at the University of Ottawa, where he heads the U Ottawa Legal Technology Lab. Wolfgang specializes in international economic law and computational analysis, and his research examines trade, investment, dispute settlement using data-driven methods. Wolfgang, when you hear that line about taking the world as it is, how do you see the world right now?
Yeah, first of all, Kelvin, thanks for the intro, and I'm glad to be here. So piggybacking on what Carlo said, it's not only uncertainty that's really marking where we are, but also just a sense of complexity. So many things are hitting us at the same time, and it's very, very hard to navigate that. It's hard to navigate because there's a lot of interdependence between many of the things that we are seeing. And it is clear when we talk about food exports and the food industry in general that our relationship, for instance, to the United States is deeply connected to also how we can deal with China and vice versa. So it's a really, really complicated and messy world. And I think Prime Minister Carney, his starting point is that he realizes this complexity and he's trying to navigate it with agility. And I think it's a very useful and very grounded starting point. I think the other thing that is interesting about his comment is that it opens up space, because linked to his comments about we are in a rupture, not a transition, it invites us to think a little bit about what comes next. And that's, I think, on the one hand, an opportunity, but also a bit of a challenge. It's an opportunity for gatherings like this to imagine what are different outcomes, what are different narratives that could dominate the future of the food trade. But it's also a bit of a challenge, as we've seen already in the poll. People don't agree. Where should we prioritize? Should we double down on our relationship with the United States? Should we explore our relationship with other partners? And it's these types of tensions, I think, that will be very visible both in our domestic conversation, but also in our international conversation. That makes this time especially, I think, volatile.
And so Chris, let's come back to you and pick up on this theme of tensions. You have transitioned to a role inside China. You've seen the Prime Minister there. I was wondering if you could give us your perspective on the state of Canada-China relations today, the impact of the PM's visit, and where you think things are going next.
Thanks, Tyler. I think certainly they're in a much better position, obviously. I mean, even just the change in government last year, as an example, right, when Carney replaced Trudeau, that helped because the relationship was so strained and so frayed for all sorts of reasons. But I think what I've been saying to Chinese officials for the better part of last year is, Carney in many respects is like President Xi, right? He's a technocrat, he's pragmatic, he will look to make a deal, but what he won't do is he won't litigate these issues in the public, right? Which is something that the Chinese abhor, and he won't be sanctimonious. So where there's a deal to be made, he'll make it. And when there's not a deal to be made, he'll say, well, listen, we're just going to move on to the next. I will say, too, that certainly in the readout from both the Canadian side and then Chinese officials, I know the meeting that the Prime Minister and President Xi had in South Korea last October was slated or scheduled for 20 minutes. It went for about 43 minutes, which is quite unusual from the Chinese. And it was the Chinese who asked for the meeting to be extended, which was very, very positive. And then when the Prime Minister was in China last month, he had both the meeting with President Xi, and then President Xi offered a working lunch. And then that working lunch was extended a little bit. And not every world leader who has that opportunity to meet with President Xi gets both a working lunch and then have that extended. And from the Chinese perspective, they were really pleased with the lunch, the conversation, the forward-lookingness, right? There wasn't much relitigating the past, which I think often tends to happen in some of these conversations where you did this and therefore I did this. It was, how can we build forward? Which I think when you look at what Carney's trying to do and the fact he's going to India next month as well, right? Everything he's framing is forward-looking, which I think is exactly what business and industry are looking for from the government, I should say. I think the one caution I would note, and I've been in Ottawa for a couple of days chatting with some senior officials. China, though, they've almost put Canada on probation to a degree, right? They are somewhat skeptical that the reset is as significant as we might think it is. They're really going to see what happens with the CUSMA renegotiations, because there's a reticence or a hesitancy to really think that Canada's never going to pivot away, like this from the United States. So do we go from 70% or 77% down to maybe 70% or 63%, whatever that might look like, right? And how much of that implicates China? So they want to see if it's real, what Carney is saying. That's the first piece. The second piece is what they're really interested to see is, what does the relationship between Canada and the US look like? For every meeting I've had in the last year with Chinese officials, they are beyond perplexed as to why the US is treating Canada this way. They just cannot reconcile it. And, from a Canadian perspective, I say the same thing. We're really challenged to understand it as well, right? So I think what they're trying to do, Tyler, is to try and figure out, what does Canada-US look like going forward, but what does Canada-China look like going forward? And then what are the implications for other countries that China trades with? Because if the US is treating Canada like this, right, what are they doing to the other countries? And then and this is, I think, the key point, what is then the leverage that China has with all of these other countries? And as I said, last month alone, there were 6 world leaders through China, and it's this constant cycling through. It's like a turnstile. The last point is, the one that really everybody now is focused on is Trump is supposed to be coming in April. And then what does he negotiate with China, right? Because whatever that deal is, what that framework is, that will inform what Canada will get through CUSMA to a degree. But what it will really inform is what the relationship or the framework of a deal going forward with China can really look like, right? Some of those impediments that Trump referenced last month on Air Force One. Well, Canada can't do this, Canada can't do that, and my goodness, Canada could lose ice hockey, right? All that sort of nonsensical stuff. So that's, I think, where Canadian officials are trying to figure out, what does the U.S.-China meeting look like in April, and then how can Canada build off of that? I'll leave it at that, Tyler.
Yeah, and so before we get into kind of Canada-US and where that's going, I am curious, Chris. We saw great news on a lot of ag issues, good progress on ag commodities in China. We didn't see the same progress on pork and fixing those pork issues. Can you just speak to that for a minute and kind of what's a bit unique and where you think that might go?
Well, my expectation all along was that we were not going to see much movement on pork. The Chinese had made it quite clear over the fall and early part of the winter that from their perspective, they wanted to see movement on EVs first and foremost. And they have long equated EVs with canola, right? You did this to us on a really important commodity. We're going to do this to you on a really important commodity, right? When you look at the market share of canola going into China, it's about 5 billion. Canadian pork is about 500,000. When you look at some of the other wins that Canada got, for example, on beef, that was not a tariff issue, right? That was an atypical case 5 years ago. So that was more geopolitical. When you look at pet food, that wasn't a tariff issue, right? That was avian influenza. So there were certain things that China could offer Canada that weren't tied to tariffs. From the Chinese perspective, and I've heard this from officials at MOFCOM, which is like the Canadian equivalent to the industry department, they were not they were never going to give Canada everything, right? Because our relationship had been so strained for so long. And as many of you would know, in China, it is always very incremental. And it's the same with the Canadian government, right? You have to rebuild that trust. So I think what the Chinese are looking for is, so we've done the first round or the first phase, however you want to frame it. We're going to get JETSI working. We're going to get other working groups working, and we're going to see if what Prime Minister Carney said in June or July when he first spoke to the Chinese premier, in New York in September to the Chinese premier, in October when he met President Xi, now in January when he met President Xi, if everything he's been saying is in fact how he's going to operationalize this relationship. So, obviously our members are frustrated, and understandably so. And government, I would say, in fairness, worked very hard, Tyler, to try and get pork as part of that package. But it was very clear from the Chinese side that they were not going to do it. And I would say, lastly, the Chinese wanted probably to see a little bit more on the Canadian side that was a give that Canada wasn't prepared to give, right? So something was not going to be satisfied. But I think objectively, from just a purely crass political perspective, you've got a commodity that farmers have to know, can they plant in about 6 or 8 weeks? And it's 100% tariffed versus a commodity that still is being exported. It's at 25%. And, Carney's got only so much political capital. So obviously our members would have loved to have had that immediate relief, because it's been since last year. And it had nothing to do with them, right? It was a steel and aluminum tariff that Canada put on China. And the reaction was, well, we're going to tariff fish and pork. But, my sense is that I'm optimistic. It won't be tomorrow, but certainly the government has a path forward, and we appreciate that.
Carlo, on the day that Carney's meeting with President Xi happened, and there was the announcement that tariffs would be dropped, I think there was still while there was excitement in Canadian agriculture about those tariffs being dropped, there was also some immense nervousness and apprehension about what the reaction would be from the White House. So when we look at the interplay here and Canada, where Canada is in the middle between the U.S. and China on a lot of this, what's your thought on the way the U.S. has reacted to the warming of relations between Canada and China, and how this potentially impacts CUSMA review and renegotiation later this year?
Well, on the U.S. reaction, I'd have to take a second to check my Twitter feed to see what the Americans have said. Look, that is
Does it matter?
Partially a joke, but it's also serious. We spent so much time obsessing not over the U.S. writ large, but over each individual statement by the Americans and reacting to each statement, rather than doing the harder work of analyzing whether the statements have basis in policy, whether they're tied to other actions, or there's a string of statements. So our ability to analyze and understand China has always been problematic, but we built capacity to come up to speed on China, to better understand China. Unfortunately, we haven't done that with the new U.S. And we see this in our obsession with each individual tweet. It's one thing we're doing here at the University of Calgary, trying to build new capacity to understand the new U.S. But the state, I've joked in my Substack that it's not just that the Americans live inside our heads rent-free, but it's sort of like we're paying them rent to live inside our heads. That's how bad it is in terms of our obsession with the U.S. But look, on the overall relations with the U.S., trade has increased with the U.S. China has slightly declined. So if you look at like the 10-year average of all agricultural trade with China and the U.S., we're sitting, I think, about 5 points above the 10-year average last year. And with China, we're down like 2 points below the 10-year average. So the point here is that as much as government can influence trade with tariffs or with aspirational goals to enter new markets, the reality is it's the folks for whom Chris works that make the decision about where we go. And especially with the U.S., businesses, despite the difficulties, have consistently turned to the U.S. market, and they continue to do so in the face of uncertainty. Fortunately, we have the ability to manage some of the uncertainty with the U.S. that we don't have in China, the subnational engagement. We're members of groups like SARL, the State Agricultural Rural Leaders, not state and provincial, state agricultural rural leaders. So we have the ability to interact with the Americans, not just at the federal level, but at, I would argue, the more critical subnational level to resolve issues, to gather intelligence for market access. We simply, despite recent investments by beef, pork, and others, we don't have that sort of intelligence in China. We're nowhere near what the Australians and others who know the market well have. We may get there eventually, but there's so many things that tie us to the U.S. Geography, gravity, sunk cost in infrastructure, sunk cost in supply chains, that the aspirational goals of government don't match the business reality. And we've got to keep front of mind that business trades, not the government. And so with the U.S., that means we're going to continue to deal with these issues. But look, trade with the U.S. is up. And for beef, pork, and animals, that is about 85% of our exports go to the U.S. and they continue to rise. So we've been able to manage those tensions. I think eventually, as we gather more intelligence on China, as the global situation changes where China can no longer depend on rules-based trade, it can no longer depend on its investments in infrastructure, in suppliers, not just for food, but think of what happened with oil in Venezuela. China thought they had a pretty good deal in terms of guaranteed oil from Venezuela. That was pulled out from under them. So I made the argument in the China Daily that China needs to rethink its complacency in terms of BRI and other investments to guarantee food security in a world where the U.S. just yanked the Venezuelan oil rug out from under them. That may play to our advantage if we can push that in China, that we have never embargoed the export of food. The Americans embargoed wheat to China during the Great Famine. You talk about weaponization of trade. What China's done with canola is not weaponization of trade. Banning food exports when you have millions of people a year dying from a famine is weaponization of trade. And I think we really need to start distinguishing ourselves globally, that we simply don't do that, and we haven't done that.
Is this overture with China, or this reset, maybe would be the better word, or rewiring? I heard that term used here as well. Is that compatible with Fortress North America, with Canada, U.S.,
Sure.
Mexico? Yeah.
Absolutely. We've moved to an era of managed trade, not free trade. So everything isn't on the table. It's specific issues where we have complementarities and where we're looking to fend off competitors like the Americans. So I think you can have a Fortress North America for security, AI, defense-related issues, quantum, the American small garden with high walls for certain technologies. It's not as easy as it sounds. Of course, there's a lot of nuance in this, difficult conversations. And the Americans, of course, leverage security concerns for expanding export restrictions. They've done it to us in Cuba. In the 50s, they did it to us in Africa, in Europe, and they continue to expand security into areas that really aren't security. But as Wolfgang said, it's complex. And part of the cost is complexity in dealing with these issues.
So I'm going to go to Wolfgang with a question, but remind the audience if they want to put questions, use the Q&A function in Zoom, and we'll get them to our panelists. But Wolfgang, you talked about complexity. Carlo talked about the potential for food security playing out. I'm curious as to kind of where you think food actually fits in this broader geopolitical issue. I think Carlo's written about the potential for food to be used as kind of a bridge, to kind of as this leverage for Canada. Is that really something that's available to Canada as a major food exporter? Where do you think that this actually fits, and how do we actually do something to take advantage of that?
Yeah, I think that's the million-dollar question, and I'll come back to something that Carlo said at the end of my remarks, because I think he's spot on trying to segment the issues, trying to potentially compartmentalize trade so as to really reap the benefits of food-related trade and to make a statement not to weaponize food trade. But let me first maybe set out some of the changes that we've observed, because, of course, agricultural trade has always been somewhat of a different animal. It's subject to different rules at the WTO. There are more restrictions, so it's always been a bit different. But I think it's important that the events of the past 5 years have really added additional complexity to that. Of course, first of all, the war between Ukraine and Russia that has created ruptures in international supply chains, raised the specter of famine in large parts of the globe that were dependent on grain exports or fertilizer exports from Russia and Ukraine. And so food security is really on the top of the agenda. Next month, countries are going to meet in Cameroon for the 14th Ministerial Conference of the WTO, and food security is explicitly on the agenda. So trade and food security are connected in a way that they haven't been for maybe decades. The other thing, and of course Chris mentioned it, is that food is increasingly becoming a collateral damage to some of these geopolitical tensions that we've seen. And I mean, everyone is aware of course, how that has played out in the relationship between China and the and Canada. But of course, it's also used in other contexts as part of our retaliation package against U.S. tariffs. We remember putting tariffs on agricultural exports of the U.S., such as orange juice. So food is part of that equation because it's sort of the soft underbelly, the politically salient underbelly. The last thing I would mention here, and I think we have to not forget about it, is that we are now in a world of increased protectionism, of higher tariffs, especially by the US. And that creates distortions like we haven't seen them again in decades. That means that, for instance, Canadian food growers are now facing imports that used to be going to the United States. But now that these tariff walls are up, they are being shipped up north. And so not only on the export side, we really have to worry about these geopolitical tensions, but also on the import side, Canadian agri-food producers are really in a tight spot here. So what does that all lead to? I think, and Carlo sort of alluded to it, there are different narratives, different ways out of it. And I think we haven't really settled on which one is the one that we want to go for. I think there's a debate out there whether we should double down on food trade, thinking that potentially food and also energy are these areas where it's relatively clear. It's win-win. It's not about technology. It's not about breaking the progress of China when it comes to chips. It's something that can create win-wins, as Carlo said, security of supplies for China, for instance, and export markets for Canada. But we're seeing the opposite effect as well. We have a very protected agricultural industry here in Canada as well. So we have part of our agricultural industry being non-tradable. We put walls up not only through supply management, but by tying the hands of our trade negotiators not to even negotiate on supply management. And that, of course, is the entire opposite direction of trading more in agriculture. And we see this also in other parts of the world, like we've just seen the EU deal with India that carves out agriculture because it is so contentious. So not clear whether there will be more food trade, less food trade, how we deal with it. Last point I'd say is that food and agricultural trade is increasingly intertwined with other policy objectives. So we've heard a lot about food security, so the securitization of trade. On the one hand, that's an opportunity because everyone wants food security. But if you talk to the Indians, for instance, food security is also about domestic stockpiling, ideally by buying from local farmers. So it's another way of doing protectionism. And so food security is not necessarily sort of the answer to all concerns. Similarly, there's a debate around food and sustainability. The EU, for instance, has put sustainable food systems in parts of its trade agreement agenda. So potentially another area where you can deepen collaboration internationally, but at the same time, the EU is also using sustainability as a market access barrier. If we think, for instance, about the deforestation regulation that creates barriers to entry for including Canadian food exports by making it more onerous to comply with EU standards, ostensibly for environmental reasons. So it's a really complicated environment here, and it will take some time to settle on the narrative going forward.
And Wolfgang, the Prime Minister also spoke to variable geometry as this kind of new idea that kind of the old institutions aren't going to work. It's going to be this new kind of coalition, these new partnerships that are there. what does variable geometry look like when it comes to agriculture and food issues, and kind of where can Canada go to find some allies on some of these issues?
Well, I think the answer is not that it's going to be the CPTPP or those types of large arrangements. I think, as Carlo said, we really have to figure out how we can treat different sectors differently. And so there's a lot of talk around mini deals. So how can you make, for instance, slimmer deals that are maybe only on agriculture, or that explicitly carve out agriculture if it's something that's, for instance, in relation to supply management, a source of concern. So it's going, I think, away from this one-size-fits-all template, these huge FTAs, to something that's a little bit more nimble, where interests are converging, and to really explore those types of opportunities. But that will take a shift of mindset, because still in the Canadian government, it is trade, FTAs, free trade agreement. So we will have to do some adaptation there.
We do have a couple of questions here in the Q&A, and there are a couple here around sustainability and how that ties in with trade and supply chain disruption. And Chris, maybe from your perspective, is sustainability, carbon footprint, that type of information still relevant for trade when it comes to China? Or certainly Wolfgang alluded to the EU and some of the proposals that have been implemented there when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions and that type of thing, and carbon border adjustments is part of that. What do you hear, Chris, when it comes to exports to China, when it comes to sustainability and environmental aspects? Is that still important in this world that we live in today?
I think it's, so if you're looking at it from the Chinese side perspective, I should say, it's important until it's not, and you don't know when it's not going to be, right? So they could say, listen, we can't do anything with you, Kelvin, because you don't have you're not doing enough on the sustainable file. But all of a sudden they have a need. Kelvin, I'm taken back, or I'm blown away, but all the investments that you've done on sustainability in the last 24 hours. And it's going to be great to see your commodity come into China. So I think, there's a very sort of mercenary approach to how China does business, as I think we've all experienced. And it's relevant until it's not, but you don't get to decide when it's not. And they get to decide both when it is and when it's not. So you're always disadvantaged. I don't want to speak to the EU. That's a little bit out of my lane. But I would say that I think certainly when you talk to Chinese officials, they're doing a phenomenal amount of work with respect to environmental issues and environmental stewardship. They recognize that they still have a long way to go, but they are investing a significant amount. And I would also note that just, the 10 years that I've been back and forth to China and now living there, if you look at, the number of EV cars on the road as an example, it's demonstrable, the shift, right? It's at least half, if not probably 60% to 40 in terms of EVs to gas. So I think you're going to continue to see that. So a long way of saying it is, but it isn't, which is a pretty useless answer, I'm sure, for this group. But I think we just have to be pragmatic and not tie ourselves into knot, and understand what is the audience that we are trying to trade into. What is that market telling us? Because I think sometimes the mistake the Canadian industry makes, or the government makes, is, well, if it works here, it'll work in this market and in this market and this market. And I would conclude on this note. I had an interesting conversation with a senior official at Foreign Affairs earlier this week, and he was saying what they are struggling with is they don't realize just how different China is to negotiate with and deal with than every other market is. Intuitively, they do, but in practical terms, they don't. They don't know how to operationalize that. And I think that's what we will see in the months and the next 2 to 3 years. How does that pivot, or how does that shift begin to take place? And it won't be dramatic. It'll be very incremental. But even just having that recognition that we have to be a little bit more agile intellectually and pragmatically is, I think, it's a modest breakthrough, but an important one.
So I'm curious. One of the themes that's come up in the discussion is kind of that we need to think differently about this. And Carlo, maybe go to you for your thoughts first on this. But it really seems like we're in the state of flux. I think everybody touched about kind of this complexity about this change that's happening. Chris just talked about the need to think differently about the relationship with China. Carlo, you talked earlier about the need to think differently about the relationship with the United States, better understand these dynamics. How much of this is kind of we're learning on the fly and we're trying to figure out, and how much of this is kind of we just need to act differently than we have in the past? Do you want to start on that, Carlo?
Sure. Well, obviously, if you use words like rupture, unprecedented, it implies that you would be thinking on the fly. And if you have the ability to predict these things and have policies in advance, well, you're living on a yacht in the Mediterranean someplace because, that, but we don't. So we are by nature making some of this up. I think one of the issues we face in Canada is the shock has also forced us to traditional ways of thinking and traditional mechanisms of engagement. If you're in the government, you have to respond quickly. The same thing with business. We really don't have the ability to reflect and think longer term or about fundamental changes to how we operate. So this is where folks like Wolfgang and I that have the space in academia to be able to step back and think, play a more critical role. It's also where previous investments in intellectual capacity, in intelligence capacity, through business associations, through think tanks, plays a role. So we've been hindered by our lack of investment in the foundational capacity to adapt to change in Canada. So this is one of the reasons I think why we're struggling, and we're only seeing that incrementally. It also ties too, if you think about it, to some of the fundamental tenets of trade. The conversation, what strikes me about the conversation about diversification, about the U.S., is the assumption that the government can sign a trade agreement or point to new markets, and there's an assumption that we will be able to access these markets, that we have the physical capacity, we have the assets to be able to access markets. Look at Roberts Bank 2 at the Port of Vancouver. We spent 12 years officially, 14 unofficially, trying to get a shovel in the ground to increase our largest port. In that 12-year period, what's happened? China went to Peru and built the new port of Shanghai, a port that will rival Rupert in its first year and will eventually reach the capacity of Vancouver. So the world isn't standing by. Well, we make aspirational goals that we don't have the infrastructure to meet. Even were we to modernize Vancouver, we would only catch up to where Shanghai, not even to where Shanghai started from, but where other ports in South America are. Our best efforts will still leave us behind. And for some agricultural commodities, we were fortunate that Shanghai wasn't break bulk. It was containers, and Chris, it was reefers. They're increasing capacity to move what we move. If you look at what Peru exports, the answer is, what does BC export? What does Canada export? What comes out of the Southern Cone? So that element is stunning to my mind that it hasn't penetrated our discussions about actually having the assets to meet our aspirations on trade. So if I'm in Asia and I'm looking at Canada, yeah, you've shown up. Yeah, you signed some agreements. But when I see a Shanghai come up in a decade, I'll know you're serious. And I'll know you actually have the ability to supply me. I hear you talking, but I don't see the walk with what you're saying.
Carlo, does that mean we need to, in terms of action items coming out of this, do we need to just prepare and to invest more in, well, not only getting big things done here in Canada when it comes to the port example, but invest in those relationships and having people like Chris on the ground and having kind of that remain at the forefront of our key trading partners' minds when it comes to maintaining relationships through this more uncertain, more one-off type trading environment?
Absolutely. You need facts on the ground and you need people on the ground. You need people on the ground long term. We have a great reputation. Our nickname globally is Canada. We're known as Casper, the friendly ghost. Show up, disappear, show up, disappear. The America strategy under Harper, serious long-term investment? Not. We showed up with a big fuss and disappeared. Earlier engagements in Asia, same thing. Big announcement, show up, we expect the world to welcome us back, and then we disappeared. So folks like Chris going over, we've got to be clear that this is going to be what the Australians do. We're not showing up to disappear again. We're going to have Chris there, and there will be someone after Chris, and there will be someone who comes after whoever comes after Chris. We have to build the infrastructure, not talk about doing it like we spent 12 or 14 years with Roberts Bank. How many consultations do you need to build something? One or two, not 13 or 14. So until we make those demonstrations of concrete seriousness, not talk, but action. And lastly, we need the capacity in Canada, the intelligence capacity, think tanks, research centers, the deep connections beyond the transactional selling that give us intelligence. We were slowly building that in China. God help us with India. Walking in with your eyes wide shut was what we did with China. If that was the case, what we're doing with India, God help us. We're deaf, dumb, and blind, not just blind going into India. So it's all those investments. We think we've taken the easy one with agreements and the stuff that's simple and easy, but the more foundational investments for an era of generational global change. Again, this isn't Nixon. This isn't going to be over in 4 months. This is generational, and those investments are deep. Infrastructure, intelligence capacity in Canada, and intelligence capacity on the ground to show people that we're serious.
Chris, can you speak to, I guess, your role? It's still relatively new, and how it came about, what it all involves, and maybe what it would look like if we had more Chris Whites on the ground in China, maintaining that ongoing presence.
Sure. Well, how it came about was earlier in my career, I was a chief of staff to a number of federal cabinet ministers. And what always struck me when stakeholders or industry would come in, there was always this inherent expectation that government could fix all of your issues. And, they would come in, Kelvin, and say to the minister, well, I need you to do this for me. And you would just, you'd be on the other side of the table and you would be thinking, but how can you even come in with that kind of an ask, right? You've never met the minister, or, at best, the minister has this much political capital, this many stakeholders that he or she have to manage. So like the conversation just starts off on the wrong footing. And I was in China in 2019, and we went to the port of Shenzhen, which is it's a significant port. And, picking a bit up on Carlo's point, the officials at JCC, so sort of, their customs group, if you will, said to me, happy to see you. It's great that you're here. But what's really problematic about Canada and Canadian industry, not just ours, but sort of more broadly speaking, is the only time we see you is when there's a problem. And you can appreciate in China what an awful frame that is to have, right? It's the problem child, particularly at the port, because as I'm sure many of you have seen, the volume that flows through there, it's incomprehensible until you see it in person. And then if Canada is responsible for that kind of a blockage, that's a huge problem, right? Because it further erodes the credibility, and it diminishes all of the goodwill and all the good work that industry is doing. So what I've been saying to my board for a number of years was, we cannot just go into China once or twice a year for 1 or 2 days in Beijing and then off to some other part, and then go home and pat ourselves in the back and think we've done a great job in China. We've really advanced our issues. And at the same time, at the height of the tensions, I would go over to China and I was getting better meetings than our officials. And it's not that they weren't trying, and it's not through lack of effort. It was just, Chinese officials were refusing to meet with them. So they would meet with me, and I would ask our embassy officials to join. So as I reminded my board, you have an advocacy office in Ottawa for red meat, right? The Canadian Meat Council, or you have the Canola Council, you have whatever, Fisheries Council. But for a market as critical to industry as China, the advocacy strategy can't be this, right? We can't go to bed thinking, well, we have access today, and we wake up and we've lost it tomorrow, and we've got nobody on the ground. And if the embassy's not getting meetings, and we're only going over once or twice a year, what's happening for those other 360 days? No one is there to advance our issues. No one is there to explain our challenges. So, from the industry perspective, our industry's perspective, they recognize, because of some of the challenges we've had over the last number of years, that they wanted to have a physical and a sustained presence on the ground. And I think Carlos referenced it earlier. The U.S. have presence, the Danes have presence, the Spaniards have presence, the Australians. I mean, the list is very long. But what's really interesting is the Brazilians, who have about a 63% market share of beef going into China. They are now opening an advocacy office just for beef. So in a world where the Brazilians are thinking, 63 is not enough, right? What else can I do? I would really like to see the office that I'm running become a little bit broader. And by that, either other industries come in, because again, one person such as myself isn't going to make any tangible difference. But what it does do, both politically and visually, is it changes the narrative. You say we don't care about this market? No, hold on a second. Industry has just invested and put somebody into this market. You think we're not here enough? Hold on a second. We've got somebody now here 365 days. And the last observation is, it also helps the Canadian government, right? Because what we are telling the Canadian government is, we're not looking to you to fix our problems. We're going to work with you, and we certainly need your help where we can and where you can help us. But we know the totality of responsibilities you have, and you're not the subject matter expert. So whatever brief we give you and you bring into a meeting, it's going to be this, right? As opposed to somebody who has to work on these files all the time. But what it also does do is, Kelvin, the relationships that I have built over the last number of years, and certainly being on the ground, are different than some of the ones that the Canadian embassy or the consulate staff have. So the embassy is getting a line of sight, but then I'm also getting a line of sight. And then I can then feed that back into Ag Canada, CFIA, Trade, Global Affairs. So they're getting a little bit of a broader scope, but it also allows me, when I'm talking to Chinese officials, given my political experience, to explain to them what's going on in Ottawa that they're not necessarily going to get from the embassy or the consulate staff, which they find really helpful. Because in China, they, as I said earlier, they're really flummoxed or perplexed by the Canada-US dynamic, but they're perplexed by a lot of the Canadian political environment. So it's helpful to have somebody who can act as a bit of an interlocutor that's not government, but has that kind of an experience. So excuse me, I'm hoping very much that we'll see other commodities invest in that kind of a presence, because, if we don't, every other country is looking to China to export. And the more investments those other countries put into that market, that's where those benefits will be derived.
I have I think, a relatively big question for Wolfgang, but Chris, just as a follow-up, since TMX came online, we've seen energy exports from Canada increase to China. Are we seeing the energy sector potentially doing what you're talking about? And is there a way that there could be some synergistic benefit of a different Canadian commodity on the ground in China?
Well, I think, you've got Manulife, you've got Bank of Montreal, like, and CCBC, the Canada-China Business Council, has a lot of member companies, as most of you would know. I think the template is pretty basic, right? If you're going to be in Canada because you've got issues with Canada, well, you're likely going to have a lobbyist or a trade office in Ottawa. Well, if you've got challenges which everybody does in China for all sorts of reasons, it's not a negative. It's just the reality. It's a very complex environment, and it's a very difficult government to penetrate. Sorry. It's just your advantage to do so. Some companies, they will hire a Chinese lobbyist, but I think it's invaluable to have a Canadian presence on the ground. And again, it's the signal, right? It doesn't, you're not necessarily moving the file forward like you might in Ottawa, but it's changing the narrative to say, Calvin, I do care about this market. I want to be here in a sustained fashion. So don't think for a minute that this is an important market, because if you're not there, That unfortunately is the perception. We see you once or twice a year. It's clearly not that important a market to you. So therefore, we're going to talk to Wolfgang or Carlos or Tyler. But if you were here, then that's a completely different conversation. And I look forward to seeing you, Chris, at this event or this event, right? And it just changes the whole dynamic. And the very last point is you have some trade associations who work in Ottawa, and you know what it's like, right? When you walk down Spark Street, you inevitably will run into a senior official or a politician or a staffer, and you have those off the unscripted conversations, and that there's an exchange of information that's both useful to them and to yourselves. Well, that's what it's like when you're on the ground in Beijing. You will see an official, or you'll see a diplomat from our embassy or other diplomats from other embassies, and you get a bit of intelligence that you didn't have that will be informative for your commodity, but also for others, and just gives you a better understanding of how to do your job and advance your issues.
Okay, appreciate that insight there, Chris. Wolfgang, we're almost an hour into this, and I know 6 months ago, 8 months ago, 10 months ago, I think it was maybe last April that we heard now Prime Minister Carney in the election. Well, I guess he was Prime Minister then already, but in the election campaign, refer to China as the greatest security threat to Canada. It's not that long ago we were talking about the two Michaels, and of course there's the Taiwan concern that lingers over all of this. How do you see the current Canadian Prime Minister's office navigating the red lines there? Is this about compartmentalizing trade, as alluded to earlier, or how do you see the Carney government navigating that massive turnaround? It feels like in terms of our perception or the way China is talked about in terms of government tone and language in Canada.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think there were two dangers 6 months ago, how Canada would react. One was complacency, not doing enough to face that monumental shift. But the other one is overcorrection, overdoing it. And I think the Prime Minister and the government is trying to navigate these two. It's a very bold government, and I think the deal with the framework of an agreement with China was, I think, unexpected to many observers, the amount of substantive progress that has been made. Now we are maybe then a little bit more in the danger of overcorrecting, and that's what we see with the United States. How can we manage that relationship with China, both for our own sake, you mentioned security concerns, but also commercially, so that we don't lose market access or trade market access with the United States. And it's about finding that balance. And one way of finding that balance is by compartmentalizing. It's by recognizing these interdependencies and really teasing out that space where we can find room for cooperation without burning bridges with respect to the United States. And I think that's going to be the big challenge. I think it's possible, but it really takes some creativity to do it. And I think, as Carlo said, we do need that deep thinking in order to help that space. And as Chris said, the boots on the ground to get those signals to identify the landing zone potentially for the type of cooperation.
So these are kind of big topics. We probably didn't book enough time to cover this all, but I want to wrap with a question to each of you around. I think, Carlo, you answered this partly already, but is this generational change? Is this a long term? Is this kind of a rupture, that one of the other words that's been thrown around, or is this, a turbulent couple of years and then we go back to normal? So Carlo, do you want to answer that, and then we'll go to Chris and Wolfgang for their thoughts?
Sure. But can I get in a quick comment on the issue we face in responding to this requires, as I've said, facing increased cost to fund people like Chris in market, costs for more visits, costs for capacity. What I worry most about is the willingness of producers to pay for this. Time and time again, and you know how much time I spend in rural communities, on farms, meeting with elevators, talking to producers. But time and time again, I see an unwillingness of producers to pay the cost. It's great that Chris is there and beef has stepped up. But on the other hand, Richardson pulled out of the Canola Council. Kelvin, you may know if they've come back, it's your beat. But how can you have businesses and producers not fund what we now realize are basic needs? I remember being in southern Alberta talking to a government that was going to visit China, or no, Japan. They had had 4 or 5 visits from Japanese buyers in the community that were finally making a return trip. And talking to the council members for the government, they were worried about blowback from their constituents for wasting money on a junket to travel. So the problem isn't just federal. The problem isn't just other markets. There's something about Canadians I don't see in Australians and others who are on the ground. So I'm calling out the producer community and farmers and other producers. You're going to have to step up. You're going to have to pay more. Richardson, Viterra, you're going to have to come back to the table. Sorry, what was the original question?
So maybe
I went off on my rant.
Yeah, spin on that. Is that going to be a long-term investment, Carlo? Is this a
Yeah.
long-term change, or is this something where we go back to normal?
You can only give an answer with probability. I would say I am 80, high 70, low 80% that this is going to be generational. I think the move of the US from beat cop to shakedown artist and its use of uncertainty, the benefits that have accrued to the US from using uncertainty as leverage, I struggle to see why the Americans would give that up unless the pain becomes so great for them. I just don't see that happening. Again, this isn't 1971 with Nixon, where you had a competent administration with a clear plan and a world that was more amenable to making the adjustments that Americans want. You also have China, which you didn't have in the 70s. You had Russia, but who traded with Russia? Nobody. And what did you buy from Russia? Vodka. So you have a really different world where China is so integrated and such a large trade power that I don't see how this can be anything but long-term generational change. But again, high 70%. So I do admit that there was a large space for uncertainty, and events happen, things happen. So you also have to factor that in as well.
So Chris, how do you think about where things are going to be 5, 10, 15 years from now?
Well, I would just reassure Carlos that the Canadian pork producers are big investors in the office. So we've got, beef packers and processors, pork packers, processors. So from that perspective, we've got the farm to fork investment. So we're very grateful for that. I wouldn't go beyond 5 years, Tyler, because I think the world is just so fluid right now. I would say that, when people looked at the first Trump administration and they felt that some of the policies that he put in place and they would be either removed or marginalized when Biden came in, and the Biden administration said, no, in fact, we like this, right? This is useful to us. So I think that a lot of what Trump is doing with respect to tariffs or some of the other constraints that he's putting or challenges he's imposing on other countries, I don't know that whomever is in office in 28, they need the revenue, right? I would say, though, what I find really fascinating about China is just the demographics. So right now, when you look at the population of about approximately 1.3 billion, you've got a demographic of between 400 and 500, or close to 450 million middle class. In the next 12 to 15 years, that's expected to double, right? So you will have a middle class population of about 900 million people. So that's a market that Canadian companies from across any commodity will want to have access to and investments in and all of that. So part of the challenge for Canadian companies now is to get in now, because so many other countries are already doing that. They've looked at the numbers, they've looked at the metrics, they've looked at the demographics. Excuse me. They've looked at how what the needs are going to be. And Canada, what really frustrates me is, we talk about China as our second most important market. And at the same time, Canada's got the embassy, obviously, in Beijing. Then we have 5 consulates. In one of the consulates last summer, we had 25 staff, and then we cut 80% of the staff. So we're down to 5. So, we really want to be here. We want to invest. We want to invest. We want to invest. but hold on, we're about to downsize, downsize, downsize. So it sends just such contradictory messages. So, it goes back to my comment a few minutes ago. Industry has to be responsible for our own issues in that market. We have to be our best advocates. And as I say, the government officials we work with are terrific, but we're expecting to see some cuts at the embassy. We're expecting to see some cuts at the other 4 consulates because of this downsized exercise. And, the message from China is, well, you want to be here, but you're not really as invested as country X, country Y, country Z. So it's we're happy to have you, but we're going to focus over here. So I would say, Tyler, I wouldn't look much beyond five years. But I think it's such a fluid but dynamic environment, and there's so many uncertainties. And then, from a Canadian industry perspective, obviously as much certainty as we can have. But I think the challenge is, you look at even within the G7, between now and the next 5 years, you're likely to have at least 4 or 5 of those leaders out of office, right? So, 5 years is ambitious. We don't even know if we're going to have an election this spring in Canada. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but I don't like those long-term projections, right? Because it's just, what did Christian say, right? It's hypothetical, right? If my grandmother had wheels, she would have been a bus, right? So I think, we're just trying to focus on, can we get through the spring, right? We've had China, we've got India coming, and we've got CUSMA, and then we may have an election. So I'm happy to pick this conversation up end of the summer, early fall. Thank you so much for the invitation this morning.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. And so, Wolfgang, it will be up to you to maybe give us that definitive answer. Carlo was only giving us probability. Chris was only looking out 5 years. Wolfgang, what's the long-term outlook for this at the end of the day?
Well, I'm a lawyer, so if you ask a lawyer a question, what's the likely outcome? I'll give you both sides. So I think the key is that it is change, it is a rupture, but at the same time, we also have to guard against what I said earlier, overcorrection. I think there the business community really has a role to play to rein in maybe some of the more outlandish instincts potentially of the government to recognize the importance of the relationship with the United States, to keep that as close as possible within all the constraints. But the other thing, of course, is also to remember that although our Prime Minister said that nostalgia is not a strategy, some of the things that used to be there are worth preserving. Our best trade agreement is the WTO, the World Trade Organization. And we should work as hard to keep that organization alive as we should work on building new partnerships. And I'm a little bit concerned by that overcorrection, that we lose sight of that. And it's important both for our exporters because of the market access that we get, but also for our importers' cost of living crisis. We haven't talked about this much today, but of course, many Canadians are struggling with affordability. And so let's not overcorrect. Embrace agility, but these are challenging times, and I think Team Canada will walk through.
All right. Well, we are running a bit over time here, so I'd like to thank our panelists, Chris, Carlo, Wolfgang. Certainly some good perspective, and I think we have some pretty clear takeaways, action items to move forward and look for signals that the Canadian government and our industries in agriculture can work towards meeting those goals and those outcomes that we'd like to see when it comes to the Canada-China relationship and what that means as well with the Canada-US relationship. So thank you to all our panelists. Also, thank you to those of you who popped questions and thoughts into the Q&A. Apologies that we didn't have time to get to all of them. Certainly, this is a topic that warrants lots of discussion, and we could definitely come back to them in the future. So please note that the recording of this webinar will be available on YouTube, both on CAPI's channel and on the Real Agriculture YouTube channel in the next day or two. So with that, thank you for joining us. Stay tuned for our next policy webinar with CAPI and Real Agriculture, and enjoy the rest of your day, everybody.